Welcome to part two of the lecture on the ethical issues of the abuse of RWOPS. In this part, we will zone in on the ethical issues and we'll also consider some legal considerations for dual practice and specifically considering the abuse of dual practice for RWOPS in South Africa. Are practitioners entitled to professional freedom to engage in dual practice? Now, this is a question that I think is important to ask from the outset when we think about the ethics of dual practice and RWOPS in particular. A libertarian would argue in favor for people to be able to engage in dual practice. And so they would argue that health professionals are entitled to professional liberties, and these liberties must be protected. As we've discussed in the previous part, there are clear benefits to dual practice, and these benefits are due to professionals, some may argue, such as monetary benefit, professional development, and this is also important to consider because there has been a brain drain when it comes to health professionals, where professionals choose to emigrate and practice in other countries for reasons which include professional development and monetary benefit. So when we allow practitioners to practice in multiple jobs, then this serves as a way to retain professionals, and it also allows them that professional freedom, which some argue is due to them. So it seems fair to allow practitioners freedoms that will improve their professional and personal development, and I think this is quite clear and obviously fair. The freedoms, however, have to be regulated in order to avoid the abuse of RWOPS. So what I'm saying is that there is no issue with dual practice so long as it is not an abuse of the principle or the concept of dual practice, and obviously it's not to the detriment of people involved and institutions involved. So, an important thing to consider, especially when trying to mitigate abuse of RWOPS, is the best interest of the patient. Now, the principle of beneficence says that a practitioner has a moral obligation to act in the best interest of the patient. So, it is important then to note to what extent does the abuse of RWOPS affect the public patient, or to what extent is the abuse of RWOPS not in the best interest of the patient? So an example is if a practitioner is overworked and fatigued, and this could diminish their ability to act in ways that promote and maintain the best interest of a public patient. And beneficence really is about promoting and maintaining the best interest of the patient. And so a person who is not physically, mentally, or emotionally able to do that because they're fatigued cannot protect the best interest of the patient. And this is absolutely important in patient care. And so, in an extreme situation or circumstance, what could happen is because of the abuse of RWOPS and overextending themselves in multiple job holding, this could in fact result in the complete opposite, which is the harm caused to the patient or injury caused to the patient, as described in the previous part as consequences of dual practice abuses. Now, as you remember from the past, virtue ethics is essentially a normative ethical theory that is focused on the character of a person, so habitual actions and their dispositions. And I think a really important virtue that must be discussed when talking about dual practice is professional integrity. And so integrity refers to the quality of the person, and professional integrity is absolutely important for all professionals and especially health professionals in this particular instance. So breach in professional integrity occurs when a practitioner does not honor or violates the terms of their employment at their primary job because of RWOPS. And this would be a result of working too much time at a secondary job, and all of the abuses associated with dual practice as previously described. What this essentially raises is an issue that now this puts to question the integrity, the professional integrity of a practitioner, because what would happen is the professional has primary duties at a primary job, and so they have to honor that. They have moral obligations to those patients, to that institution, and to the contract that they've signed and consented to. And so, if they don't honor that and violate that, in terms of violating their terms of employment, because they're working in another facility, it really can put their professional integrity to question. And the consequences of RWOPS can result in that patients, institutions, and the public sector as a whole is compromised because of practitioners' actions. And what this does is it not only affects the patient individually, it puts the profession and institutions to disrepute, which effectively puts to question the entire profession's integrity and not just the individual professional who partakes in dual practice. And so it is very important to understand that professional integrity is very, very important. The professional integrity and the quality of the individual person, as well as the public sector integrity, really matter in determining the trust relationship that occurs between public health institutions as well as patients and the society at large. And so the risk of violating integrity is really high because it affects the attitudes that people have towards institutions, certain practitioners, and the public health sector in its entirety. It's also important to note that when the professional integrity is put to question, this could be a result of the practitioner being unable to resolve conflicts between their obligations at their places of work. And this is very important because if you have a primary job, you are obviously have loyalties to that particular job, and you want to make sure that you address whatever terms of your employment have been specified. So if you find that a practitioner is conflicted to the extent that they don't know how to manage their obligations and duties between their place of work, it also puts to disrepute the private sector or other sectors that they may be involved in. And so there's quite a big risk when you think about professional integrity at an individual professional and the entire profession as a whole when it comes to the abuse of RWOPS. I would say the important thing when it comes to allowing practitioners to be free to practice in dual practice and maintaining the integrity of the individual and professional society as a whole, as well as making sure that patients are important, can be done in a way where these factors and these ethical issues must be balanced in such a way to make sure that the best outcomes for the patient, the institution, and the public health sector are protected and promoted. And so basically, while practitioners can have professional freedom, and in fact, perhaps should have professional freedom, because there are benefits, these freedoms must be regulated, and there mustn't be a compromise in the professional integrity, both individual and broad professional integrity, and the patient must not, absolutely must not be compromised by a practitioner practicing in multiple health facilities. So we briefly touched on conflicts of interest as we discussed professional in integrity of the practitioner. And so let's just go into what conflict of interest would be in terms of RWOPS. So, conflict of interest refers to a conflict between public duties and private interests of an employee, in which the employee has private interests which could, firstly, improperly influence them. Now, if you recall, in the first part, I mentioned a practitioner that was earning a large number of funds through the secondary job. I think it was under 800,000, and it was quite close. This 800,000 was earned in 6 months, right? Which means that they could earn 1.6 million in a total year, and I'm assuming this is either before or after tax. It's immaterial. But then they work in a public facility and they earn, between 1.1 million to 1.3 million annually in the public facility. So if you see there's a 500,000 gap in the financing, or at least the remuneration that they receive, and private sector is more profitable for this particular practitioner. Now, this could improperly influence this particular professional in that they could say, well, I should probably prioritize the private sector because I stand to gain more money. So obviously, one of the benefits of remunerated work outside of public service is that there is monetary gain. However, that should not improperly influence someone to the extent that they neglect or violate their public duties. The second issue is that it negatively impacts on the disposable time to work, and this basically means that one, they don't want to spread out the time in a way that's fair for their primary job, um, as well as this pertains to this issue of abuse of sick leave and other types of leave where they are free times either after work or during their leave, and they don't use the time effectively to either rest, to take sick leave, but instead use the extra time or time after primary job work to be involved in secondary work. And obviously what happens is the cycle of fatigue, the cycle of overwork will come in, and that negatively affects the ability to work in the facilities that they have primary duties to. And of course, if they have unbalanced disposable time priorities, they're overworked, this could negatively impact their official obligations or official duties. And this is when you hear of cases where practitioners do not show up for work even when they're supposed to. And this means that they don't meet their deliverables. This negatively affects patients and the institution as a whole. And finally, it negatively affects public interest. I mean, as we previously described when we talked about the best interest of the patient, this extends to the public in general. And it's very important to consider that when someone abuses RWOPS, they not only put themselves at risk because they're overly worked and could find themselves making mistakes at their place of work because of fatigue, but this has public interest impact. It will affect how the society perceives practitioners and institutions because of the type of integrity that a specific practitioner has. Now, I think another thing that's also important to note is that this is positioned in a way that doesn't consider a health system that already has internal issues such as shortages of staff. It doesn't consider issues such as pandemics, where there's an increased or an influx of number of patients. It does not consider, for example, the implementation of a specific policy, which means that certain people have obligations to make sure that they implement the policy in a health facility. So if you can imagine confounding factors, such as a pandemic, such as poorly staffed environments, such as implementing an important policy so that there is change in a particular community. If there are practitioners who abuse RWOPS, some of these issues can worsen the health system. And for example, in the case of a pandemic such as COVID-19, if practitioners are just not at their place of work, this has implications and life and death implications for patients. And so you can see that the conflicts of interest are not just merely dilemmas that sit within, the professional themselves. These have direct and indirect implications for individual people, such as patients, the population and society as a whole, as well as the institutions that they work for. Okay, so remunerated work outside of public service is regulated, and the specific legislation piece that speaks to it is the Public Services Act. Section 30 of this act says that no employee shall perform or engage himself or herself to perform remunerative work outside of his or her employment in the relevant department except with the written permission of the executive authority of the department. And so what this means is that remunerated work outside of public service is not something that people opt in and opt out of without any form of regulation. Currently, the way in which it's done is that an application must be made to an executive authority or delegated member for the executive authority of the department, and that person will effectively look at um, whether or not the RWOPS will affect the employee's public service duties. And this could be done through looking at the number of hours and number of commitments that they have in the public service, and also the possibilities of the new or secondary job and what that would mean for the public service. And so an executive authority must consider this and weigh the options in order to see if it's one feasible and allowable for the person to engage in RWOPS. So public service regulations of 2016 also have specifications in section 13B. It specifies that no one should engage in any transaction or actions that is in conflict with or infringes with the execution of his or her official duties. And so as the executive authority considers whether they should provide someone with an opportunity to dual practice, it is important to look at the possibilities of conflicts or possibilities of limitations to their professional duties. And what this intends to do is it intends to prospectively see if there's an issue that may arise with someone having or engaging in dual practice, and how can that be mitigated? And if it cannot be mitigated, perhaps they should not be allowed to partake in remunerated work outside of public service. So, and another thing that is important to note is that there are rules and limitations in terms of even if one is granted permission to dual practice. And Section 13I says if he or she has permission in terms of Section 30, so they've applied to an executive authority and they have approval to perform outside remunerative work. So they should not be doing this one in official work hours. So you cannot leave your place of work, your primary job, even if there are no patients, right? You cannot clock out and leave that place of work earlier than you're supposed to go work at the secondary job or in another health facility during the official working hours of the primary job, which is usually the public sector job. And secondly, the practitioner cannot use official equipment or state resources for secondary work. And these specifications are absolutely important and demonstrate that regulation has to think very thoroughly about every single issue that can occur to ensure that the abuse of RWOPS is mitigated. Okay, so we are now done. These are a list of references that you can follow up on. I've included the directives as well as the acts and the regulations. And I think it's very important that given that we do have a history of remunerated work outside of public service abuses, that there's clear and specified regulation that speaks to that so that practitioners are aware that even though they are entitled to freedoms, there are limits to freedoms. And these limits aren't there to limit their professional development, but there must be a balance between professional and personal development of the practitioner, as well as the best interest of the patient, as well as the integrity of the profession as a whole. With that, this is my last lecture with you guys. It has been a pleasure to prepare and record these lectures for you. I hope you thoroughly enjoyed the lectures as much as I did. And please, again, feel free to contact me should you have any questions about any of the lectures that I have given to you, and especially, of course, this lecture. Thank you so much and keep well.